Introducing Transgressor 2 from Boz Digital Labs.
Tell me all your lies.
The original Transgressor raised the bar for transient shaping, giving you unprecedented control over the transient and sustain of your audio by allowing you to EQ them independent of one another. Transgressor 2 continues this tradition while improving the workflow and toolset of the original. The result is a transient shaping tool unlike any other. The interface is broken down into three main sections: Transient, Sustain, and Detector. The Detector helps Transgressor 2 identify transients. We can lock the Detector settings using the padlock button at the top of the Detector panel. When active, this keeps your Detector settings intact while you explore presets within Transgressor 2. Audio coming into Transgressor 2 is split into two identical signals. The main signal goes to the threshold control. Audio above the threshold is considered a transient, and audio below is considered sustain. We can see the level of audio being detected as a transient or sustain by looking at the transient and sustain panels in the center. At the top of the EQ graph for each panel, we see visual indicators of the signal being processed. We can change the behavior of the detector using the exclamation point. When active, audio absolutely must breach the threshold to be considered a transient. This is useful for percussive sources like drums. When inactive, audio that gets close to the threshold can be considered a potential transient. This can be useful for pulling transients out of melodic sources with low dynamic range. A second copy of the input signal is sent to an internal sidechain filter. This allows you to choose which frequencies the detector will target when searching for transients. We can use the sidechain listen feature to monitor the audio in the sidechain after any filtering, which helps us isolate the frequency content that will give us the most accurate transient detection. The sidechain input selector allows you to cycle through three sidechain options. Internal uses an identical copy of the main audio source for transient detection. External allows you to use a separate audio source, and MIDI allows you to use MIDI information instead of audio. The sidechain input includes three filter options. The first is a pair of 24 dB per octave high and low pass filters. These are used for focusing the detector on broad frequency ranges to isolate transients in melodic sources. For example, we can find the pick attack of a bass guitar in the mid-range between 700 and 1200 Hz. Once we've isolated the transient in the detector, we can adjust the threshold accordingly. As we turn off sidechain listen mode, we can now manipulate the attack and sustain of the bass guitar using the gain controls on the center panels. The second filter uses a bandpass filter with an adjustable bandwidth. This is useful when trying to detect snare transients without the toms triggering the detector, as you can narrowly target the snare's frequency content in an area where the toms may not be interfering. Now we can increase the attack of the snare without adding attack to the toms that have bled into the snare mic. We can also EQ the snare transient without EQing the bleed of the toms. The third option completely disables the filters applied to the sidechain. This can be useful when sending audio from drum triggers into the external sidechain input, as the only audio coming into the detector will be the audio you want considered a transient. When using MIDI detection, the filters are inactive. Transgressor 2 will send any incoming MIDI information to the threshold control. The MIDI detector is velocity sensitive, allowing you to keep lower velocity notes below the threshold. This allows us to use the threshold control to prevent low velocity mistriggers from being seen as transients. Below the threshold is a retrigger control. This helps Transgressor 2 avoid mistriggers by automatically waiting a predetermined amount of time before considering anything else as a potential transient. When using an isolated source in the sidechain, such as a drum trigger or MIDI, mistriggering is less of a concern. In this case, we can leave retrigger at its lowest setting of 30 milliseconds. However, when using audio that isn't isolated or has lots of sustain, it may be helpful to increase the retrigger time to avoid artifacts and improve the accuracy of the detector. Using multiple detector inputs allows Transgressor 2 to be used in truly unique ways. For instance, if we turn off the sustain panel, we can use the transient panel alone as a hard gate and 4-band EQ for our drums. Simply turn up the release until the decay of the drum sounds natural. Or we can create an expander by activating the sustain panel and reducing the gain. We still have bleed, which can help the drums feel more natural in the mix.
Trust what you has been kicked through the door.
This can be incredibly effective when using an isolated drum trigger or MIDI information in the detector. We can use Transgressor 2 for reducing or boosting drum transients in our drum overheads. Here we have a snare drum that is quite present in the overheads. We can turn this down by sending the close mic from the snare into the external sidechain input of Transgressor 2. We can now turn down the gain on the transient panel to reduce the attack of the snare in the overheads. One easy way of setting the right transient size is to deactivate the transient panel, then turn up the hold time until you no longer hear a transient. Now deactivate the sustain panel and reactivate the transient panel. Adjust the release control until you hear a smooth transition from transient to silence. The result is a well-defined transient and sustain that can be independently targeted. At the heart of Transgressor 2 is a powerful EQ and analysis section. In this window, we can see the waveform of the audio passing through Transgressor 2. We also see the transients that have been detected based on our detector settings, and we can see the 4-band EQ of the transient and sustain sections. The EQ section allows you to emphasize or correct frequencies of the transient or sustain independently. This can be useful for reducing harsh clicking in the attack of a kick drum without impacting the sustain. Or for reducing the ringing in the sustain of a snare without impacting the transient. We can use the EQ to add pick attack to the transient of a bass guitar without impacting the rest of the transient.
Taking no more. Trust what you has been kicked through the door.
Transgressor 2 is more than just a transient designer. With an intuitive workflow, flexible tools, and improved transient detection, it is the ultimate transient shaping tool. Transgressor 2. Out now from Boz Digital Labs. Download the demo at bozdigitallabs.com.